I'm not the kind of guy who scares easily. I've hiked solo for years through all kinds of terrain, deserts, mountains, woods, even a couple of places most people wouldn't go without a group. I stay prepared. I stay aware. I bring enough supplies, my gear is always in top shape, and most importantly, I bring my dog, Max. He's a 90-pound German Shepherd mix with a good head and better instincts than I'll ever have. If something feels off, he'll sense it before I do. That's why what happened on that trail still messes with me. It was late September. The air had that crisp feeling in the mornings where you know summer's done, and fall is really settling in. I took a few days off work to get out of the city and clear my head. Found this lesser-known trail tucked up in a wooded area of northern Michigan, a place I hadn't been before. It wasn't marked well online, which I actually liked. Less foot traffic. I prefer quiet places where you don't run into folks every couple of hours asking how far to the overlook. The trail started out normal enough. Trees thick on either side, mostly hardwoods. Leaves were just starting to turn. Max was excited, nose to the ground, tail wagging, taking in every scent. I kept a good pace, stopping every now and then for water and to give him a break. After about 3 hours of steady hiking, I found a small clearing just off a ridge that overlooked the forest below. Good place to stop for lunch. We sat for maybe 45 minutes. I gave Max some food, ate a protein bar, and just sat back, watching the trees sway. There was no wind at the ground level, but you could see the tops moving. Everything was quiet, just the way I liked it. When we started moving again, I decided to take a narrower path that branched off the main trail. I figured it looped back based on the map I had, and I was in the mood to see something different. That's when it started to feel off. There wasn't a single sound. I mean, no birds, no squirrels, nothing. Max noticed it too. His ears were up, eyes scanning around, but not in a nervous way, just alert. I chalked it up to maybe a predator nearby. Fox, maybe a bear, although that was rare around here. Still, I kept going. I wasn't too far from camp, and I had my knife on me. I can't remember the exact moment I noticed her. That's the part that gets me. 1 second I was walking, looking around casually, and then she was just there, standing about 15 feet ahead of me on the trail. I hadn't heard footsteps, no rustling of leaves. Max didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't even notice her until I did. I just looked up, and boom, there she was. She was small, short, maybe 5 feet 2 inches at most, wearing a gray hoodie with the hood up, dark jeans. Her shoes looked worn out, like she'd been walking for days. Her face was pale, not sickly pale, just washed out. Eyes wide open but not focused, like she was looking through me instead of at me. No expression, no fear, no curiosity, nothing. Just blank. I stopped walking immediately. Max froze too, right beside me, his body stiff. He didn't bark, which was strange. Usually, if we run into another person unexpectedly, especially out in the woods, he reacts. Even if he doesn't see them as a threat, he'll at least sniff the air, do a low growl or perk up. But with her, nothing. He was just stiff. My first thought was maybe she was hurt or lost. But something in me said not to speak, not to move closer, not to do anything. I can't explain why, but I felt it deep down. Something was wrong here. Not danger in the normal sense, like violence or a weapon. Just wrong. We stood there for what felt like a long time, probably only 30 seconds in reality. She didn't move, didn't blink. I could see her breathing, so she wasn't frozen or anything. But she didn't react to us being there. No nod, no hand gesture, no eye movement. Just stood there. Finally, she turned. Not slowly, not dramatically. Just a basic pivot, like someone distracted. She stepped off the trail, into the thick trees on the side, and within seconds, I couldn't see her anymore. No footsteps, no sounds of branches snapping or leaves rustling. It was like she stepped through a wall. Gone. I waited a solid minute before doing anything. Max was still stiff, ears forward, eyes locked where she had disappeared. I held my ground, trying to process what just happened. My brain wanted to make sense of it. Maybe she was high, maybe mentally unwell, maybe she was hiking and just didn't want to be bothered. But I kept going back to that moment when I first saw her. She hadn't come from anywhere. She was just there. Eventually, I moved forward, slowly. I kept my knife in hand, not open but ready. Max walked right next to me like he was unsure too. When we passed the spot she had been standing, I looked into the trees where she had stepped. It was thick, thorns, branches, uneven terrain. No way someone could walk through that without making a sound or leaving a sign. But there was nothing, not even a broken twig. I should have turned around and gone back the way I came. I know that now, but something in me didn't want to backtrack. Maybe pride, maybe just a desire to get out and be done. I kept going forward. About half a mile ahead, I came to another fork. One way led back down toward the parking lot. The other continued deeper into the woods. I took the turn toward the lot. I didn't care about finishing the loop anymore. I just wanted to be near people again. On the way down, I passed a few more hikers. 2 older guys and a couple with a small dog. I nodded to them, they nodded back. That grounded me a bit, reminded me I was still in the real world. Max even perked up, some tail wagging again. I started to think maybe I'd imagined it, or maybe it was just a weird encounter that didn't mean anything. But that night, when I got back to the small cabin I'd rented near the trailhead, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how she'd just been there, how Max hadn't reacted until I did, how she disappeared without a sound. I kept going over it, frame by frame in my head. The next morning, I went into town for coffee and fuel before heading home. At a little gas station, I mentioned the trail to the cashier while waiting for the pump to run. I didn't mention the girl, just said I'd hiked the northern loop. He looked up and said, "Lot of folks don't go that way anymore. Got too overgrown." I asked him what he meant. He said some people had gotten lost out there in the past, ended up walking in circles or off-trail entirely. Nothing too dramatic, just disoriented hikers. One woman went missing years ago and was never found. Authorities thought she'd fallen or gotten stuck somewhere off-trail, but no one was sure. When I asked when that happened, he said, "Oh, that was maybe 8-10 years back. Young woman, short, wore a hoodie, I think. Name was Rachel or Rebecca, something like that." I didn't ask any more questions. I just nodded, paid, and left. I'm not saying that was her. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits or anything like that, and I sure as hell didn't see anything supernatural. What I saw was a person, a real human being. But what still makes my skin crawl is how she appeared, how unnatural it felt for someone to just be standing there, unnoticed by me or Max until the exact second we looked up. And if she was real, just a lost, confused woman, then where did she go? Why no sound? Why no reaction? And why didn't she look at us like a normal person? I've hiked a lot since then. I still bring Max, still go off the grid sometimes. But I've never taken that trail again. Not because I'm scared of being hurt. Like I said, I'm a strong guy. I know how to defend myself, and Max is no slouch either. But because that moment, seeing her appear like that, wasn't about physical danger. It was something deeper, something wrong on a level I don't know how to explain. And no matter how many times I replay it in my head, it never makes more sense. That trail's still out there, that clearing, that fork in the path. Maybe someone else has seen her since then. Maybe they didn't think much of it. But me, I'll never forget how it felt when she was just there. Not a threat, not a ghost, just a human being who shouldn't have been where she was in the way that she was. And that's what makes it worse, because it means it could happen again. To anyone, anywhere, even if everything looks normal on the surface. It was one of those still summer evenings that you never really forget. Not because something felt off at first, but because everything seemed so perfectly quiet. The kind of quiet that only happens way out in the woods, far from anything familiar. My dad and I had decided to camp out at this remote campground he had been to once years ago. He said it was one of those out-of-the-way places that not many people knew about, and when we pulled in with the truck, I could see why. There were no signs, no real road markers, just a wide, rutted-out dirt path that wound through trees for what felt like forever. The trees on either side almost leaned in, like they'd grown tall and thin just to crowd that one lane. The kind of road where you hope no one's coming the other way because there's nowhere to pull off. And by the time we found the campsite, it was mostly just a flat clearing with a rusty old fire ring and a few logs someone had probably dragged in years ago. No one else was out there. That part was nice. I'd always liked being away from people, especially in the woods. My dad and I set up our tent right near the edge of a little lake that backed up to dense forest. The lake was mirror still. Not a single ripple unless you counted the dragonflies that skimmed its surface or the distant splash of some fish. We got there late afternoon and had just enough time to unpack, set up the tent, and eat something before the sun started to dip low. He had mentioned earlier in the drive that if you went far enough around the lake and into the woods, there was a waterfall tucked back there. Something that didn't show up on any map. He'd only ever made it once before, years ago, and thought it'd be a fun hike to try and find again. I was up for it. I liked the challenge. There wasn't a real trail, just a few faint deer tracks here and there, so we had to blaze our own path. The forest behind the lake was thick and kind of uneven. Mossy rocks, patches of brush that reached up to your knees, fallen trees slick with dampness even though it hadn't rained in days. You had to watch your step the whole time. We followed the curve of the lake for a while, moving at a slow pace, stepping over roots and ducking under low branches. It felt like the woods kept trying to close back in on us the further we went. The sounds changed too. Birds got quieter, bugs too. There was still that low hum of summer, but it was fainter, like even they didn't want to go too deep. About half an hour in, we came across something weird. In the middle of a narrow section of woods where there were way more pine trees than anything else, we found a slash pile. That kind of thing wasn't too uncommon up in these woods. Cut branches, deadfall, and other forest debris all piled together, usually by forestry workers to be burned later. But this one didn't look right. It wasn't fresh, but it didn't look old either. The branches were dry, cracked, but all of them pointed inward like someone had stacked them deliberately into a dome-shaped mound. Right on top of it was a small child's shoe, just one. A tiny, dirty white sneaker that couldn't have belonged to anyone older than 6 or 7. I remember the laces were still tied. We just stood there for a moment looking at it. No other sign of anyone around. No footprints, no bag, no second shoe. Just the one sitting like it had been placed there on purpose. My dad looked at me, then back at the shoe. Neither of us said anything. He stepped over to it and poked around the slash pile a little, trying to see if anything was buried underneath, but it was just sticks and pine needles. It left a bad feeling in my gut. Not fear exactly, just unease. Like something wasn't right and we were too far in to pretend it was nothing. Still, we kept going. I think part of my dad wanted to shake off the feeling by pushing forward. Like if we just made it to the waterfall, it'd justify being out there. We walked another 10 or 15 minutes, pushing deeper into a denser section of trees. Eventually, we came to a small clearing. Just a patch of open ground maybe 20 feet wide, ringed in thick brush and fir trees. It looked like a natural break in the woods, but everything felt tighter there. The trees felt taller. The air felt more closed off. My dad stopped and said he needed to take a leak. He turned his back to me, walked to the far side of the clearing, and I turned the opposite direction to give him space. I remember just kind of looking around at the trees, scanning the bark, noticing the patterns of moss and lichen, when something broke the stillness. A voice, plain as day, from maybe 10 or 15 feet behind me. A child's voice, clear, soft, not scared or crying, just normal. "I'm over here." I froze. For half a second, I thought it might have been my dad messing with me, but the voice wasn't from his direction, and it didn't sound like him at all. It sounded young, really young. I turned fast and scanned the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, maybe a little kid in the brush. Nothing, just the same thick woods. I glanced back at my dad and saw he had stopped what he was doing and was looking at me with the same frozen expression I probably had. We both started searching. I stepped off the edge of the clearing, pushing through the brush, calling out once or twice. Not loudly, just enough to try and draw something out if someone was hiding or hurt. My dad moved in a wide circle, checking behind logs and thick trees. We combed the area for a solid half hour, maybe more. We didn't find anything. No trail, no footprints, no broken brush, no kid. Eventually, we stood back at the center of the clearing, and I could see on my dad's face that same unease I'd been feeling since the shoe. that subtle, stomach-level sense that something wasn't adding up. He said we should head back. Just like that, no more mention of the waterfall. The walk back felt different, slower, heavier. The woods seemed darker even though it couldn't have been more than an hour since we'd started. Everything felt closer. We moved fast, retracing our steps, but it didn't feel like we were alone anymore. About 10 minutes into the walk back, I heard it, a snap, not behind us but off to the left, like a branch breaking under weight. Not the kind of sound you hear from wind or small animals. It had weight behind it. It was followed by a rustle, then silence. We both stopped. I turned and looked but couldn't see anything through the trees. Then a minute later, another snap, this time to the right. We picked up our pace. Neither of us spoke. We just kept moving, but the sound didn't go away. Every couple of minutes, something behind or off to the side would move. A twig snapping, leaves rustling, a quick shuffle of underbrush. It always stopped when we stopped, like it was shadowing us. I kept telling myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a bear keeping its distance, but it didn't move like an animal. It wasn't random. It was like it was pacing us. I looked back more than once, but the woods were thick. You couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. The kind of place where something could be standing still, watching, and you'd never know. We didn't stop until we hit the edge of the lake again. The sky had gone orange and pink, and the first bugs of the evening had started buzzing around us. We crossed the flat stretch back to our tent, lit a fire, and sat in silence. Neither of us brought up the voice or the following sounds right away. It just kind of hung in the air between us. After dinner, we sat staring into the fire, the unease still thick. Every so often I thought I heard something again in the woods beyond the tent. The crack of a branch, a soft shift of weight. But it never came closer, just lingered at the edge, like something waiting. We didn't stay a second night. The next morning we packed up and left. The road out felt even longer than when we came in, and we didn't talk much until we hit pavement. We never camped there again. My dad never really said why, but I knew it was because of that voice, that shoe, the feeling of being watched, of something tracking us back through the trees. You can explain away a lot of things in the woods. Animals, echoes, even tricks of the light, but there's a line where it stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like something else. Something you don't have a name for, but you know it when it's there. I don't know who that shoe belonged to. I don't know where that voice came from. I don't know what was moving through the woods beside us. But I do know we were not alone out there, and I don't need to go back to know that much. It was mid-September, still warm enough in the day to hike in a t-shirt, but the mornings had that cool bite that told you fall wasn't far. I had taken a couple days off work, more or less burned out from city noise, and wanted to get out on my own for a bit. I decided to spend a few nights up north near some backwoods trails I'd found the year before. They weren't part of any official park system, just a mix of old logging roads and narrow single tracks, winding through thick pine forest, broken up by the occasional creek or rock bluff. It wasn't somewhere you'd casually wander into. You kind of had to know it was there, and you had to be fine being by yourself. I parked off a gravel road that used to service an old clear-cut site. The clear-cut was growing back now, thick with young birch and poplar, but the area still felt open compared to the older forest all around it. My truck was parked well off the road, pretty well hidden. I slung my pack on, locked everything up, and started heading in on foot. I had about an hour and a half of hiking before I reached the spot I wanted to camp. I'd been there once before, a small flat shelf of land about 30 feet above a creek bend. You couldn't see it from the trail, but it had a narrow game path leading to it, and the ground was soft and free of rocks. It was a peaceful place. Nobody ever came out this way. At least I hadn't seen a soul the last time I'd camped here. The hike in was mostly uneventful. I noticed a few fresh boot prints in a muddy patch near the beginning of the trail, but they could have been a few days old. I figured maybe a hunter or local had passed through. This wasn't totally untouched land. There were signs of old logging everywhere. Stumps, bits of rusted metal, a half-buried oil drum here and there. You'd find the remains of old debris piles too, the kind you get after crews clean up a site and don't bother hauling the slash away. I passed one maybe 30 minutes in, a man-made pile of wood and branches off to the right of the trail. Something about it made me glance at it longer than usual. It wasn't fresh, no green in the wood, but it wasn't rotted through either. Looked like it had been made maybe that spring or the year before. There was a flattened edge to it, like someone had leaned on it recently or something heavy had brushed it. I didn't think much of it at the time, just logged it in the back of my mind and kept walking. I reached my camp spot in good time, set up the tent, got a small fire going in the ring I'd built last year, filtered water from the creek. I ate a bit of jerky and trail mix, then just sat and listened. There's something about being that far out alone. The silence hits differently. You hear your own heartbeat. You start to notice every breeze, every bird call, every creak of a tree limb. Around dusk, I went back up the trail a bit to take in the sunset from a small ridge nearby. I brought my small stove and made some instant coffee while I watched the light drop behind the trees. The ridge looked out over the valley where I'd seen the slash pile earlier. I could just make out the top of it, a dark lump in the middle of all the regrowth. As the light faded, the shape seemed to shift a bit. I squinted, trying to make it out, but it was probably just the changing shadows playing tricks. I stayed up there until it was almost fully dark, then walked back to my tent with my headlamp on. That night, I slept lightly. I usually do the first night out. Every sound feels closer when it's just nylon between you and the world. I must have dozed off around midnight. Woke up maybe 2 hours later to what I thought was movement near the creek. It was hard to tell with the way the water muffled things. I sat up and stayed still, holding my breath. Nothing. Probably a deer coming in for a drink. I lay back down and eventually drifted off again. The next day, I wanted to check out a small side trail I hadn't explored before. I remembered seeing a faint track about a mile past where I camped, near the edge of a rocky slope. I packed a day bag with water and snacks and headed out around mid-morning. It took a while to find the trail again, but once I did, it was easy enough to follow. The land sloped downward through thick pine and spruce, and the air got cooler as I descended. Maybe 20 minutes in, the trail curved hard left around a boulder and opened up into a small hollow. That's when I saw another slash pile. This one was larger than the first, easily 15 feet across and maybe 4 feet high. Same look, cut limbs, bits of bark, splintered trunk sections. But this one looked more deliberate, almost maintained. There weren't any weeds growing through it, and the edges were clean. I stopped and looked around. The area was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. No wind, no bird chatter. I took a few steps closer and saw something sticking out from one side of the pile. At first I thought it was trash, maybe a bit of tarp or an old glove. But when I bent down and pulled it out, it was a boot, a child's boot, faded red, scuffed, but not rotted. I turned it over in my hands. It had caked dirt on the sole, but the tread looked fairly new. I stood up and looked around again. The woods stretched out in every direction, dense and quiet. No sign of anyone. I didn't like it. I felt that tightness you get in your chest when something's off but you can't explain it. I put the boot back exactly where I found it and stepped away from the pile. Something about it made me feel watched. I took out my compass and marked my bearings, then started walking back the way I came, checking behind me every few minutes. On the way back, I passed a few more signs of man-made work, smaller piles, most older and broken down, but that one stayed in my head. That boot, the way the area felt like it had been cleaned, and the silence. That night, I didn't sleep well either. I kept thinking about how remote I was, how someone could be out there doing God knows what, and I'd have no idea until I stumbled across it. I kept the fire burning a little longer than usual and made sure I had my knife close. The next morning, I decided to cut the trip short. Something had shifted for me. I wasn't scared exactly, but I was uneasy. You have to respect that feeling in the backcountry. You ignore it, you end up in a bad situation. I packed up slowly, double-checked my gear, then hit the trail back out. The hike out was quiet until I got to the spot where I'd seen the first slash pile. When I rounded the bend, I stopped dead. The pile was gone. Not cleared. Gone. There was a patch of disturbed ground where it had been crushed grass, some with chips, but no pile. Nothing. Just empty space. I scanned the area, heart thudding. Nothing else seemed touched. I knelt down and felt the ground. The indentations were fresh. This hadn't happened a week ago. It had happened last night, or that morning. I stood up and started walking faster. Every 20 feet or so I'd glance behind me, and that's when I noticed the sound. A faint, steady crunching behind me, twigs snapping, brush rustling. I stopped, started walking again. The sound started again. This went on for nearly 10 minutes. Always the same distance behind me. Not rushing, not trying to catch up, just keeping pace. I finally spun around and scanned the trail behind me. Nothing. I even walked back a bit to see if I could catch whoever or whatever was there. Still nothing. I kept going, now gripping the bear spray in my side pouch. I knew I was being followed. It was deliberate. Someone knew I was out there. Knew I'd been close to something they didn't want seen. The rest of the hike back to the truck felt like it lasted hours. I kept waiting to hear that sound again, but it never came. When I finally saw the gravel road, I felt a wave of relief so strong I almost dropped my pack. I half-jogged to the truck, unlocked it, and threw everything inside. I didn't even change out of my boots. I just got in and drove. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Just woods. Still. Quiet. I didn't go back there. I didn't report anything either. I thought about it, but what would I even say? Hey! I found a kid's boot near a suspicious pile of wood, and then something followed me? They'd ask for names, dates, proof. I had none. I checked online afterward. Missing persons reports, backwoods incidents. I didn't find anything that matched. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't just stumbled onto someone's old work site. Someone was still out there, still using those piles, still watching. Now, when I hike, I stay on marked trails. I keep close to other people. I don't wander into places that feel too still. And if I ever see a slash pile again, I don't go near it. Not because I think it's haunted or cursed, but because sometimes, in places far off the beaten path, people do things they don't want others finding out about. And they're willing to follow you to make sure you don't. I was a few days into a backpacking trip in the Rockies when things started to go sideways. Not in a big dramatic way at first, but in that slow-burning, creeping way that works its way into your nerves and settles there. It was a small group of us, 7 people in total, including myself. We had all met through a local outdoor club, and although I didn't know most of them well, they seemed experienced and solid. I trusted that the group would look out for each other. That's part of why I'd come along. I had done solo hikes and a few overnights before, but I wanted to get more comfortable with multi-day trips in more remote areas. This seemed like a good step up. The first couple of days had gone smoothly. Long hikes, mostly uphill, with views that just kept getting better. We were following a loop trail that circled around a ridgeline and passed through some forested valleys. It was late summer, but the nights were already getting cold. The air felt thin and dry during the day, and I could feel the strain in my legs and shoulders by the time we'd set up camp each evening. On the third night after dinner, we were all sitting around the fire pit. The air had dropped to near freezing, and the warmth of the fire felt like the only thing separating us from the sharp cold that crept in once the sun disappeared. Someone brought up aliens. I can't even remember what started it. Maybe someone pointed out how clear the stars were, or maybe it was the isolation of the area getting into people's heads. But it didn't take long before a couple of the guys were swapping stories they'd heard from podcasts or shows. Abductions, lights in the sky, government cover-ups. I sat there listening, and at first it didn't bother me. I wasn't one to believe in that kind of thing, but the way they talked about it. Casual, sure, but there was something unsettling about hearing those stories way out there in the dark, miles from any town, with nothing but trees and silence around us. I started to get that feeling like your skin is just a little too tight over your body. My eyes kept drifting toward the edges of the woods, even though I knew how unlikely it was that there was anything out there beyond rabbits and maybe a deer or two. After a while, they shifted to talking about more grounded things. That might have been worse. The topic jumped to bears, real bear encounters, things people had seen over the years on different trips. One guy told a story about a black bear pushing over a tent while someone was still in it. Another mentioned waking up to see bear prints circling his campsite. I felt my stomach knot up tighter with each story. I didn't want to hear any more. Aliens suddenly felt like a harmless fantasy. Bears, on the other hand, they were real and they were out there with us. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside my tent made my heart jump. I had double-checked that my food bag was hung well away from the camp on the bear line. But that didn't stop me from imagining a large shape brushing past my tent wall. I lay still for hours, eyes open in the dark, waiting for a sound that would mean I had to get out and do something. Run, maybe, or play dead, or whatever you're supposed to do in the moment. But nothing came. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional shifting of someone else in a nearby tent. The next morning, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. My muscles were sore and my mind was foggy. I considered turning back, but the group was planning to loop back toward the trailhead over the next 2 days, and I didn't want to hike alone. The safest thing was to stay with them, so I forced down some oatmeal, packed up my gear, and followed the group down the narrow trail leading deeper into the valley. That day's hike was the toughest so far. The trail dropped steeply for most of the morning, then climbed again along a ridge that ran above a long, tree-choked ravine. The heat picked up by midday, and the sun felt brutal against the rocks. I was sweating through my shirt and could feel the weight of my pack digging into the base of my spine. But the views were incredible. Sweeping lines of pine forest below and snow patches still clinging to the higher peaks. We reached our next camp area around late afternoon. It was a wide, flat patch just above a small lake. The trees opened up enough to give us some sky, and the lake water was freezing but clean. A couple of people went for a quick dip while the rest of us set up camp. I chose a spot a little uphill from the lake and cleared out a bed for my tent among some small, soft pine needles. I made sure to keep my tent at a decent distance from the others but still within eyesight. I didn't want to be too far off, not after the night I'd had. That evening was quieter. Everyone seemed tired from the hike, and we all ate and moved slower. I kept my eyes scanning the edges of the trees while I brushed my teeth and packed my bear bag. I strung it up away from camp and made sure the knot was tight. I didn't want to be the reason a bear came wandering in. I crawled into my tent just as the last light faded and zipped up the fly tight. I must have slept for a while, because I woke up and it was deep in the night. I could tell because the cold had become sharp, and the forest outside was completely still. I lay there listening, eyes open. At first, I thought maybe I'd woken from a dream, but then I heard something. A footstep. Not a branch snapping or an animal scurrying, but the soft, deliberate crunch of weight on dry needles. Then another, closer. I held my breath. There was no moon, so I couldn't see anything beyond the mesh of the tent. I lay still, heart thudding, trying to guess how far away it was. Maybe 20 feet, maybe 10. Too close. The steps stopped. I waited. A full minute passed, maybe more. Then came another sound. Not a step this time, but something brushing against nylon. My gut turned cold. I realized it was someone else's tent being touched. Something or someone had walked through our camp. Still, I lay motionless. I knew better than to make noise. I had bear spray, but it was in my backpack at the foot of the tent, not in easy reach. All I could do was wait. Then I heard it again. Slow, heavy steps moving away, fading. Eventually, the silence returned. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there in the dark, waiting for morning. When the sky finally started to lighten, I slowly unzipped the tent and stepped outside. My breath hung in the cold air. The others were still quiet. I walked cautiously around the camp, looking for prints. Sure enough, in the soft dirt near one of the other tents, I saw them, bear prints. Clear, close. The spacing told me it had been walking, not running. It had passed through camp slowly, maybe even looking for food. We were lucky it hadn't gotten into anything. When the others woke, a couple of them noticed the prints too. We checked all the food bags, still up, still safe. Nothing had been taken. No tents slashed. No one hurt. But the mood was different that morning. Quieter. More alert. Everyone packed up with more care than usual. We didn't talk much as we hiked. That day, I couldn't stop thinking about how vulnerable we were. It didn't matter how careful we were. Once you're that deep in the wild, you're on someone else's turf. We passed a few more patches of tracks along the trail, some older, some newer. I kept looking over my shoulder more than I ever had on any hike before. By the time we made it back to the trailhead the following day, I was drained. My legs were shaking, and my pack felt like it weighed twice what it did at the start. But the relief I felt stepping back onto that gravel parking lot was unlike anything I'd known before. I'd made it out. We all had. No one got hurt. Nothing worse had happened. But something had shifted in me during those nights. Since that trip, I haven't been able to hike without running that moment through my head. The sound of that step in the dark, the slow scrape against someone's tent. I still hike and I still love it, but there's a thread of tension in me that never really goes away now, especially when the sun sets and the forest turns cold and still. I used to be afraid of the idea of aliens. Distant, unreal, easy to laugh off. But out there, in the real wild, it's the things with fur and muscle and hunger that keep you up at night. I don't ask people to change the subject anymore when they talk about aliens. I let them go on, and sometimes I even add something to keep the story going. Because between fantasy and reality, fantasy is always the easier thing to deal with. The bear didn't attack. It didn't even get close to me. But knowing how close it could have gotten, how easily things could have gone the other way, is enough to stay with me for the rest of my life. And that night, lying frozen in the dark, I learned something I don't think I'll ever forget. Fear isn't about what might not exist. It's about what absolutely does. And it's out there walking through the trees. It was a Friday night, one of those rare ones when the air felt just right, cool but not too cold, with the kind of stillness that made everything around you seem a little quieter. The kind of night that just felt peaceful, like nothing could go wrong. So I decided to take a seat in the backyard, with a book in my hands and my laundry running in the basement. My dog was inside, lying on the couch as usual. I'd just thrown the last load of laundry in, and the house was quiet except for the faint hum of the washer working its way through the cycle. I was in the middle of reading an article online, something about strange phenomena during hikes in isolated places, but I didn't think much about it. It was one of those random things that caught my attention, mostly because I enjoyed reading anything involving the outdoors. I'd been on more than a few hikes myself, nothing extreme, but I knew the woods and trails well enough to know how easy it was to forget how quickly a peaceful walk could turn dangerous. The night was too beautiful to worry about that, though. The moon was barely visible, a thin crescent hanging in the sky. There weren't many stars out, but the sky itself had a rich, dark color to it, like ink slowly spilling across the heavens. The streetlights in the distance barely reached the edge of the yard, but that made it feel even more remote, like the world outside my backyard didn't exist. The sound of the occasional rustling leaf was the only noise breaking the silence, and the air smelled fresh, almost earthy, like it had just rained even though it hadn't. I settled back in the lawn chair, propping my feet up on the edge of the concrete patio. My mind wandered a little as I read, drawn in by the rhythm of the words and the soft, cool breeze brushing against my face. It was a nice night, the kind you don't get too often. There were no insects buzzing around, no distant sounds of traffic, just quiet, peaceful solitude. That's when it happened. I wasn't sure at first, whether I was hearing things or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But there it was again, a slight crack of a twig snapping in the distance. It was hard to pinpoint exactly where it came from. Maybe from the woods behind the yard, maybe from the neighbor's overgrown hedge. But it wasn't the kind of sound I'd normally hear on a quiet night. The air had gone still, too still, and that made everything feel off. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer making its way through the woods. There were a lot of them around here, and the backwoods was thick with trees, making it an ideal home for critters. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt wrong, like I had heard it too clearly, too intentionally. I glanced around, but there was nothing, just the same dark yard, shadows cast from the porch light, and the faint glow of distant city lights. No movement. I shifted in the chair, trying to tell myself I was being paranoid. It was a nice night, peaceful night. I wasn't going to let my mind get carried away with ideas. The washer hummed downstairs in the basement, almost like white noise to drown out the thought of whatever that sound had been. I turned my attention back to the article on my phone, hoping it would help distract me. But just as I started reading again, the sound came once more. This time it was louder, unmistakable. A distinct snap of a branch, followed by a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. My heart skipped a beat. This time I couldn't ignore it. I sat upright in the chair, trying to figure out where it was coming from. My eyes scanned the edge of the yard where the trees met the lawn. The fence, a high wooden thing, was dark against the night, but I could just make out the rough shape of the trees beyond. The feeling in my chest was different now, a weight, as though something inside me had clicked into place, and I knew, whatever it wasn't just an animal. The noise was far too deliberate, too heavy. I stood up, trying to keep calm, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a person? But why would someone be out there at this time of night, making noise in the dark on my property? A chill ran down my spine, and I instinctively started walking toward the back door of the house. I kept my eyes fixed on the dark edge of the yard, not wanting to turn my back on whatever was there. The faintest of shadows seemed to shift just beyond the fence, but it was so dark I couldn't be sure. I knew the feeling, the tension of something lurking nearby, just out of sight, and the pulse of adrenaline racing through my veins. I moved quickly now, half turning my head to glance over my shoulder as I walked, my hand resting on the door handle. My heart was racing, and my mind was doing that thing where it loops over every possible scenario, each one worse than the last. What if someone was out there watching me? What if it wasn't someone at all, but something else? I didn't want to think about it, but I couldn't help it. It was the kind of feeling that made you second-guess every normal thing. The sound came again, closer this time, unmistakably near the fence. I grabbed the door handle and yanked it open, not caring how loud the sound was. The cold air slammed into me as I stepped inside, closing the door behind me and locking it immediately. My mind was still racing. I hadn't even realized how fast I was breathing until I heard myself, sharp and shallow. My hands were trembling, and my stomach churned with nerves. I didn't even want to look out the window. I didn't want to know. I stood there in the dark of the hallway for a moment, leaning against the door, trying to steady myself. It wasn't until I heard the distant hum of the washing machine again that I realized how silent everything had become. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and it wasn't from the cold air this time. I walked through the house to the kitchen, flipping on the lights, trying to shake the unease that had taken hold. I glanced at the window above the sink, at the dim shadow of the fence, still visible in the distance. Nothing moved. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching that spot, hoping to see nothing, but the longer I stared, the more uneasy I became. Eventually, I stepped back from the window, the quiet of the house pressing down on me. My breath still wasn't quite steady, but I forced myself to calm down. There was no reason to freak out. It was probably nothing, some animal or maybe a neighbor's kid sneaking around. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had to stop thinking about it. Finally, I turned and headed toward the stairs. I needed to relax. I didn't want to stay on edge, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling in my chest. The need to check again. I had to. I stood by the door, looking through the blinds for a while longer, but the yard was still empty. There was nothing but the shadows of trees. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. I didn't go back outside, didn't even touch the laundry in the basement. I kept the lights on for the rest of the night, and when the washing machine buzzed, I ignored it. The thought of stepping back out into the dark made my stomach turn, and that's how I ended up staying inside for the rest of the evening. Even after the laundry finished, I didn't feel like going back outside. My backyard, the place I'd always felt so comfortable in, now felt like an unfamiliar and dangerous space. Something was out there, but I didn't know what, and I didn't want to find out. In the morning, everything seemed fine, as if nothing had happened. The backyard looked the same as it always did, calm and empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, something waiting just outside the light, hiding in the dark corners of the trees. I never did go back outside that night, and the next time I did, I made sure to check every corner of my yard carefully first. I don't know what it was that night, but I do know that sometimes the dark is more than just dark. It hides things, and it took a long time before I felt comfortable sitting outside again.